This German city doesn't exist anymore. Its name was Königsberg, a city that was once the pride of the German nation, but 80 years ago, it was wiped off the map forever. But that's not going to stop us from traveling to what's left behind, because today, we are retracing the haunting final days of old Königsberg while learning why the heroes of the Soviet Red Army turned its lights off for the last time. The ghosts of this lost German city can teach us an invaluable lesson from history that's never been more important to learn. I'm the Borscht Bandit, and this is my journey across the former Soviet Union. Join me as we uncover stories and legacies, the Soviet sagas. We are heading to modern-day Kaliningrad for the 80th anniversary of Soviet Victory Day to retrace the history of how Königsberg became a Soviet stronghold, visiting remnants left from the German city, and exploring the World War II battle that ended German rule here forever.
Вы продаете геевскую ленту? Да. Можно мне один, пожалуйста?
Можно.
Да.
I'm here today in Kaliningrad with my Victory Day flag here, wearing the St. George's ribbon, May 9th, 2025, for the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory against fascism, the day that World War II came to an end, or as they call it in this part of the world, the Great Patriotic War. It was on this day that years of bloody conflict came to an end. In just a few years, this continent saw a level of death and destruction that is simply incomprehensible to the modern mind. Over 50 million people in Europe would die from this war. Half of that number, over 26 million of those people, were citizens of the Soviet Union. Look at all the people gathered here today. This day is sacred for millions across the former Soviet Union, especially here in Russia. It's understandable, of course, especially when you know how many Soviet people gave their lives in this war. You can see people carrying photographs of their family members who served. This is a tradition in Russia known as the Immortal Regiment. These people will march together later with these photos to remember the Soviet heroes who marched together over 80 years ago. But what if I told you this day should be sacred for all people? And why do I say that? Well, to understand why this victory was so important, we have to understand what was defeated. We have to understand what was on the line if the Soviet Union and its allies lost this war. To understand the heroism of the brave Soviet soldiers, we have to understand the villains they defeated, Nazi Germany. And there's no better place in Russia to learn about this villain, as Kaliningrad is the only place in Russia that was once part of Nazi Germany. These are the few remaining remnants of the old German city of Königsberg you're seeing now. If these statues and bricks could speak, they could tell you about the brave Soviet heroes who fought here. They could also tell you about the cries and screams of death, final moments of a conquered people who falsely believed that they were the racially superior master race that could never be defeated. Yet, they were defeated anyway. Of course, I'm referring to the long-removed East Prussian people that built these buildings. And by the time I'm done telling this story here today, it should be crystal clear why this day should be sacred to all people everywhere. Because there is one important lesson in this history that has never been more important for all of us to learn, so that we never again, ever repeat this horrific history. There's probably nowhere better to start the introduction to this now extinct region of Germany that was once called East Prussia than over a delicious plate of Königsberger Klopse. These creamy white meatballs were a traditional East Prussian meal that was developed right here in the long-lost German city of Königsberg. You can still order these today in Kaliningrad's fine dining restaurants as a local reference to Kaliningrad's predecessor. Believe it or not, they're still served all over what's left of modern Germany today, even if the city that created it doesn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, East Prussia wasn't just delicious meatballs. It has a very dark and evil side to its legacy. East Prussia held deep symbolic weight. It was the land of the Kaisers, where the first Prussian king was crowned in 1701 in the fortress city of Königsberg. But the roots of East Prussia's identity go even deeper, to the Teutonic Order, German Crusader knights sent to conquer, convert, and colonize the pagan tribes who spoke a now extinct Baltic tongue called Old Prussian. And over the centuries, this region became Germanized, but not entirely, as significant Lithuanian and Polish minorities remain. The first Lithuanian book was printed right here in Königsberg Königsberg. The city even had its own Polish-speaking Lutheran seminary. East Prussia may have been a part of Germany, but it was often made to feel like an outsider. It spoke a dialect of German that borrowed Lithuanian words like alus for beer. Its regional food recipes like Batenbarch mirrored the borscht of their Slavic neighbors. That's why many Germans didn't see East Prussians as fully German. But then Germany lost the First World War, and the old Prussian monarchy fell. New borders gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea via the Danzig corridor, cutting East Prussia off from mainland Germany. Then Lithuania seized even more land in the north, turning the Prussian town of Memel into the Lithuanian city of Klaipėda. The Prussian economy, based on foreign trade, collapsed, and so did the region's German pride. East Prussia now found itself isolated, economically shattered, and vulnerable. And into this weakness stepped a new voice to exploit the situation: the Nazi Party. By 1925, the Nazis had set up shop in East Prussia and soon found their local champion, Erich Koch, a brutal mini-Hitler figure who turned uncertainty and ethnic tensions into political fuel. Taking advantage of pre-existing bigotries, he blamed East Prussia's troubles on ethnic scapegoats: the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Jews, and the Bolsheviks. In Koch's Nazi vision, East Prussia wasn't just German, it was the most German, as a racial colony bulwark against the East. But the Nazis weren't the only ones offering a solution. Their main adversary was the fast-growing Communist Party of Germany. People at the time said that East Prussia was caught in a struggle between the swastika and the sickle. The Communists weren't cowards. They even fought the Nazis in the streets. They denounced racism as a tool of the wealthy to divide the working class. But too many East Prussians gave in to their nationalist fears and racial bigotry and committed their support to the Nazi cause. And by 1933, when Adolf Hitler rose to power, East Prussia already had the highest level of Nazi support in Germany. Erich Koch wasn't just a party leader anymore. He now ruled the region of East Prussia. And what happened next would drag East Prussia into the darkest chapter of its history. After 1933, under Nazi ideology, Jews were banned from public roles as they were considered to be at the bottom of a brutal racial hierarchy. By 1935, Jews were stripped of citizenship, and the persecution escalated to 1938 when Königsberg's majestic synagogue was torched and Jewish children from the orphanage next door fled barefoot into the cold. This day of darkness was felt across Germany's Jewish population, known as the Night of Broken Glass. Nearly all of Königsberg's Jews would be deported to ghettos or death camps by 1942. Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Mali-Trosteniec. For the 80th anniversary of its destruction, the Königsberg synagogue would be rebuilt in 2018 in its original design as a symbolic rebirth of a new Jewish community here in modern Kaliningrad. Holocaust survivors from Königsberg celebrated this rebirth at the reopening ceremony while bearing the memory of their community erased and a Königsberg that watched in silence. So right across the river from the rebuilt Königsberg synagogue is the rebuilt Königsberg Lutheran Cathedral. Let's head over there now and we'll continue this story.
Мне, пожалуйста, один светлый пиво.
Да. Вилки тут. Вы уже были вчера?
Да, очень. Я люблю этот город.
Вы у нас не кушали еще. Надо покушать.
Да.
У нас вкусно.
Вкусно, да, очень вкусно. Еда, много еда здесь, очень вкусная. Да. И вы из Казахстана, да?
Да.
Да, хорошо.
Приходите к нам покушать сюда. Кушать.
Да. Я буду.
There is an unwritten law you must follow as a redneck like me when traveling across the former Soviet Union, and that is, if you see a Soviet barbecue, it is your sworn duty to stop and eat delicious meat. There's one thing that separates real barbecue from fake, and that's a good old smoke ring. Check that out. So this market here is on the same island as the Lutheran Cathedral I was talking about earlier. Today it's called Kant Island. Back before the war, it was called Kneiphof Island, and it used to be a densely populated urban area, as you can see in these old depictions. Did you know that the bridges that connected this island to the rest of the city are the origin of Leonhard Euler's contribution to the mathematical graph theory in 1736? Good thing this ain't a math video. But anyway, you can see this island is clearly de-urbanized. The cathedral is now one of the few permanent structures left, and this is a direct result of the destruction destruction left from World War II. But before I get into that, I want to talk about the significant role Old Königsberg and East Prussia played on the Eastern Front of that war. When the German Wehrmacht launched its 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union from East Prussia, Nazi leadership expected an easy victory, grounded in their belief in racial superiority over the Slavs and the Jews. In the opening weeks, over 30,000 Jews were executed by the Einsatzgruppen, East Prussian police units repurposed for mass murder. Colonel Otto Losch, later promoted to general, led East Prussian forces in the attacks on Riga and Leningrad. In Leningrad, nearly 1 million civilians were starved to death during that siege. This battle that Losch would describe in his memoir as earning his East Prussian soldiers immortal glory led to a mass atrocity and war crime. East Prussia became more than a military base. It was the ideological model for Nazi colonial rule in the East. Its racially stratified governance was exported to occupied Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. Local collaborators, shamefully and foolishly, initially welcomed the Nazis, but Nazi racial policies swiftly revealed their greatest mistake, because Slavs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents were quickly classified as subhuman. The disabled were executed as burdens. All were destined for forced labor and extermination. The aim was total colonization of Eastern Europe by German settlers, with the locals reduced as slaves to serve them. Erich Koch, the brutal Gauleiter of East Prussia, launched his crimes in 1940 with the execution of 1,558 mentally disabled people, and he rewarded the killers with amber boxes and Nazi vacations. In 1941, he was appointed Reichskommissar of Ukraine, where he oversaw the murder of over 20,000 Jews in mass shootings. Koch infamously declared, "Ukrainian children need no schools. What they'll learn, German masters will teach." He also said that any Ukrainian deemed worthy to dine with him should be shot. By 1944, under Koch's rule, 1.2 million Jews and 4.1 million Soviet civilians had been murdered in Ukraine. As the Red Army and partisan fighters pushed westward, Koch and his officials retreated to Königsberg. Meanwhile, General Losch attempted to stall the Soviet advance. After months of brutal fighting and retreat, he prepared to lead the defense of Königsberg. And during this chaos, 13,000 Jewish forced laborers were marched into the city. Like I said earlier, this island was a densely populated area back in the old German days. If you were an old citizen of Königsberg, you'd likely remember this area as one of the core centers of your city. We can even see some of the remnants of the urban life here in these old tram tracks that probably took passenger trams right past this beautiful cathedral. While this is the original Königsberg Cathedral, this is not what the cathedral looked like after a fateful day in August of 1944 when the RAF British bombers firebombed Königsberg. And within 2 nights, the medieval city center, especially this very island, was nearly obliterated. Survivors jumped into the River here to escape the flames, only to be consumed by the phosphorus once they emerged. The cathedral's roof was completely destroyed. Only really ruins of the walls remain. But thankfully, the grave of Immanuel Kant was mostly undamaged. Immanuel Kant was a brilliant philosopher from Königsberg back in the 1700s, and honestly, he deserves his own video. Of course, today, this island has been renamed after him by a Russian people that have adopted him as their own, a symbol of local pride for a modern Kaliningrad. This cathedral sat in ruins for most of its time after the war. It wouldn't be restored until the 1990s, and when the Russians were carrying out the work, they discovered hundreds of children's skeletons. They initially thought it must have been casualties from the British bombing raid, but unconfirmed witness testimony has claimed that these are actually the remains of some of the Jews that I mentioned earlier that had been evacuated to Königsberg from their concentration camps to use as slave labor to prepare for the final defense of Königsberg. The Nazis brought so much death across Europe that it followed them right back to this ground. But if you think about it, there's no greater revenge for the Nazis than the descendants of the Soviet Red Army laughing and enjoying themselves with delicious food and drink on the same spot 80 years later. Right across the Pregel River, or as it's called today in Russian, the Pregalia River, is an original building that actually survived the war for the most part. The old Königsberg Stock Exchange building. Here's a photo of it before the war. And imagine if these old German lion statues could talk to you. Like they could tell you about the horrific screams of death they would have heard on multiple occasions throughout the war. And of course, they're still here. While much of the original city was destroyed, this building was damaged somewhat during the 1944 bombing. For example, you can see here in this photo, the building has been hit, but it is a lot more intact than the ruined structures back across the river on Kneiphof Island in the background where we were just a minute ago. This building was one of the only, if not the only, building restored under the Soviet administration in 1967 to serve as a marine cultural center. And one of the things that saved it was its beautiful neoclassical architecture design. And this is an original piece of one of those famous Königsberg bridges I was telling you about earlier. Of course, that bridge had to be rebuilt as well. Late 1944 saw Königsberg shaken by bombing raid, scrambling to prepare for the coming Soviet offensive. Erich Koch's Nazi leadership refused civilian evacuations, insisting all citizens aid the war effort and fight to the last man. They used civilians to hastily build fortifications, while old men and young boys were conscripted into the ragtag Volkssturm militia units, which I will discuss later. Christmas 1944 was surreal. Families feasted lavishly in denial, celebrating what would be their final holiday in the city as if the war didn't exist. That delusion ended just weeks later when the Soviet Red Army reached East Prussia's borders. And by January 1945, they had encircled Königsberg to begin their final siege. The Nazis then forced thousands of Jewish captives on death marches towards the seaside village of Palmnicken, guarded by Ukrainian collaborators who had been trained to work as concentration camp guards. They lied to the Jewish captives about where they were going, claiming that boats awaited them to take them safely to Sweden, but fewer than 3,000 survived the march. Those who collapsed were shot, leaving a trail of bodies behind them along the roadside. Once they arrived, they brought them to the frozen Baltic Sea, where there were no boats to Sweden. The SS used some Hitler Youth, child soldiers, to keep the captives under armed guard, and gave the children alcoholic schnapps to prepare them for what followed. Martin Bergau was one of the Hitler Youth holding guard over the Jews lined up that day. A Jewish mother, realizing what was about to happen, asked Bergau to let her move up in line so she could be executed next to her daughter. Bergau accepted, but when she stepped out of line, another young Hitler Youth began to beat her with the butt of his rifle. Bergau shouted at him, telling him that he gave her permission and to let her continue. The perpetrators then prepared their rifles and ordered the captive to wade into the icy water and opened fire without mercy. One of the few survivors, Eva Nagler, said that as the innocent people were shot, she heard the screams of the wounded and suffering. Ich lebe noch! Ich lebe noch! And as they cried for help, the Nazis walked through, shooting any of the wounded to finish them off. Thankfully, Eva Nagler escaped, so she could later write about the event in her book, Massacre on the Baltic. And today, this story is known as the Palmnicken Massacre. Königsberg was called the fortress city for a reason, because it had 15 forts spread around its edge. But these forts were built in the 1800s. By 1945, they were quite outdated, crumbling reminders of a different era. But the Nazi forces still had to use them regardless, because it was their main defensive line around the city. Today, many lie in ruins, but we're going to visit a couple of the intact ones, starting with one of the most intact, Fort number 11, Dönhof. By early 1945, the Soviets had encircled the city, cutting it off from the rest of Germany. Food was scarce. Civilians were in a constant state of hunger, being rationed with just 180 grams of bread a day. Desperation grew, and the Nazi commanders enforced order with brutal fear. Looters and deserters were executed. Their bodies were hung in the streets. Hitler had ordered no surrender, and Königsberg was ordered to fight to the death. Imagine the German soldiers in these damp, cold forts, sleep-deprived, hungry, morale fading fast as the Soviet artillery thundered outside in the distance. There were brief breakouts from the siege to the port of Palau, which brought supplies and evacuations. But by April, the Soviets once again encircled Königsberg and prepared for the final assault. And we're heading back in time now to another fort to watch it.
All right, so we're here right now. We're at fort number 5. We're going to figure out where we're going here. We're going to have a reenactment, I believe.
I want to re-emphasize that the Nazis did not believe this moment was possible. They viewed the Soviet people as racially inferior. How could this ethnically diverse army of workers and peasants have possibly fought their way to German soil? And for the first time since the Nazi regime sent the German communists to the concentration camps, communists were back at the gates of Königsberg. Communist soldier Bikbulatov was leading one of the many assaults that day, and he announced the advance to his comrades. "Forward, guardsmen! Nothing can stop us." You see, this army was made from millions of ordinary men and women. But what wasn't ordinary about them was their bravery and their courage. One of the Soviet soldiers fighting that day was Guard Senior Sergeant Telebayev from the 31st Guards Division. Telebayev stood up in the heat of battle under exploding artillery and machine gun fire and shouted, "For our party, for the Soviet motherland, for our great people, forward, guardsmen!" And he led his platoon in a charge against German trenches between forts number 8 and 10, breaking through enemy lines within minutes. Amid fierce close quarters combat, he killed 6 Nazis and took 3 prisoner, but he was wounded. And despite his injuries, Telebayev refused to leave the battlefield. Instead, he pressed on, rallying his comrades and pushing deeper into the enemy's defenses. His bravery helped secure a key breakthrough on the northeastern edge of the fortress city. And yet another example of unbreakable Soviet courage. Telebayev wasn't just a cherry-picked example. Across the Eastern Front, 23 million Soviet soldiers had been wounded, but 80% of those wounded soldiers returned to duty to finish the fight. This horrible war would be won by the unbreakable spirit of the wounded, as the bravery of Soviet people would not give up until the world was freed from Nazism and fascism. So you're looking at actual damage still left from the assault on Königsberg. This was a concrete pillbox outside of Fort Number 5 here, which was basically a separate fortification used to protect the approach to the main fort. On the 3rd day of the assault, on April 8th, 1945, this pillbox was destroyed with a direct hit from a Soviet 280mm projectile, and it's still here in that condition 80 years later. The day I am filming this here is the 80th anniversary of Victory Day here in Kaliningrad, so naturally I've been on the go all day and I haven't actually had a chance to eat. And that's why I'm excited to try here what I've been told is called Soldier's Porridge, which seems to be an opportunity for the people here to try an authentic food ration that their Soviet veteran ancestors may have eaten from what seems to be an authentic Soviet field kitchen. Going off the long lines here, I'm not the only one excited to fill their stomachs right now. Можно мне, пожалуйста, один гречка, пожалуйста, один? Is what I have been told is soldier's porridge. Of course, this is grechka, which I think is like buckwheat porridge, and we've got a little tea there. You can hear the gunshots in the background, I hope. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear the gunshots, but yeah, tastes like you're kind of grechka. Oh, it looks like you got a little bit of meat there. You see a little bit of meat mixed in there with the grechka, I think. Whatever this is, it's pretty well seasoned. I can see if you were super hungry, you definitely wouldn't be complaining. You'd be thanking God for getting to your next meal, probably. Yeah, that's good. As the Soviet forces break through Königsberg's outer perimeter forts, we return now to the heart of the city. But let's remember what the Soviets are walking into while we watch this rare footage from March 1945, recovered from its lost tapes and kindly provided by the Maximus and History YouTube channel. Be sure to go check them out. They have some great videos if you are interested in this history. To put it plainly, this is not the same city that it was before the war. Despite steadfast Soviet advance, Erich Koch's Nazi administration blocked most of the civilian evacuations, while the hypocritical Koch fled himself. Over 200,000 civilians remained trapped in this city when the Soviet army arrives, and Erich Koch's Nazi party expected all of them to help defend the city to the last man. By April 1945, the civilian population is surviving among rubble, already months into siege conditions. As long as they are working in the defense, they are rationed just enough food to survive. Earlier I mentioned the Volkssturm, a militia of poorly trained civilians, largely made up of old men and young boys. In Königsberg, there were 10,000 Volkssturm conscripts, forming a major part of the German defense. Nazi propaganda praised the Volkssturm as the embodiment of national and racial unity. But in reality, they were under-equipped, under-trained, and forced into service with very low morale. Deserters were publicly executed. Bodies were left hanging in the streets as a warning. This was a regular sight in Königsberg. To give you an idea, by this stage of the war, over 20,000 German soldiers had already been executed by their own side. Königsberg had 3 defensive belts. The mission of the Soviet 11th Guards Army was to push through the southern flank and reach the Pregel River, but they faced fierce resistance, fighting block by block. General Losch quickly saw that the situation was hopeless and requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused, ordering Königsberg to fight to the last man. And later that night, the Soviet 11th Guards Army courageously crossed the Pregel River under heavy fire, and by dawn they established a position on the other side, cutting off the inner defensive ring, including General Losch's command bunker, from the rest of the German forces on the Sambian Peninsula. Soviet Marshal Vasilevsky called on Losch to surrender. Again, Hitler refused. The Germans launched one last failed counterattack, and the next day the defensive structure left in the city collapsed entirely. Realizing there was no hope, Losch defied Hitler's orders and secretly contacted the Soviets, agreeing to surrender his remaining forces. The Soviet delegation would then meet him right here in this very command bunker. Let's go down and take a look.
Русский, английский, немецкий.
Окей, хорошо.
И туда заходим. Выход в другую сторону.
Спасибо большое.
Пожалуйста.
Я благодарю вас.
When Losch described his final day in this bunker, it sounds very grim. The Soviets knew exactly where the bunker was, and it was constantly taking direct hits from heavy artillery, but surprisingly it actually withstood the blasts. 2 women from the Nazi party had come down to the bunker to seek shelter, and when the officers here took them into their assigned room, they both took their own lives. That evening, Soviet officers from the Belarusian front arrived to the bunker to conclude the formal surrender, and they began immediately broadcasting the surrender out to the remaining German soldiers across the city.
Там взрывал, там салам versuchen. Werden versetzt. Der Hafen gewann selbst liegt unter dem Feuer der Sowjetartillerie. Die gesamte deutsche Wehrmacht steht vor der Katastrophe. Die Kämpfer sind von 44 Kilometern vor Berlin. Ihr selbst will begreifen, dass unter solchen Umständen euer Widerstand darf keinen Sinn haben, nur so euer ist unser Untergang.
I want to show you the maps from the last day. This is the remaining German position starting in the morning of April 9th, 1945, and by just that evening, these were the only remaining pockets of German resistance in that city. What Losch seemed to tell himself, perhaps to try and grapple with the guilt of the war, is that his choice to disobey Adolf Hitler in surrendering saved many lives, and in some ways that is true to an extent. But when we look at these maps, I think it's abundantly clear how little of choice General Losch actually had in surrendering the city. That didn't stop some of the Nazi fanatics from refusing to surrender though. In fact, one of the Nazi party officers tried to storm the bunker to shoot Soviet officers inside, but failed in his attempt. Horst Böhme, an SS officer and leading perpetrator of the Holocaust, immediately delegated new fortress commanders upon hearing that Losch had betrayed his orders. But all of these ragtag resistances were soon crushed. No one even really knows what happened to Böhme. It's assumed that he was either killed in the battle or killed himself to avoid capture. Remember old Gauleiter Erich Koch, who refused the civilian evacuations? Well, he was long gone by this point. He was able to catch a flight back to Germany where he would desert himself and live in hiding under a pseudonym for a few years before being discovered by the British and arrested. General Otto Losch was taken to Leningrad as a prisoner of war and tried for war crimes.
There was another item the Germans had overlooked. They overlooked people. And generals may win campaigns, but people win wars. And on that fatal June 22nd, when the Russian people first learned of the invasion of their country, their grim faces told of their determination to fight and to die, but never to surrender. They knew this wasn't a question of who occupied what piece of land. This was a question of life or death.
That's right. Wars are won by the people. And this war was won 80 years ago by the unbreakable determination of the Soviet people, to whom the entire world owes a tremendous debt of gratitude. They never gave up until they flew the red flag over every city they liberated between Stalingrad and Berlin. And they hoisted that same red flag over a defeated Königsberg just weeks before the end of the war. I'm here for the 80th anniversary of that final victory, and I told you at the beginning I would show you why this day should be sacred for all people, everywhere. That's because that single victory day has given us 8 decades of freedom from the threat of Nazi Germany. The scary thing to remember is that while East Prussian people who lived in this city went down the dark road of racism and fascism, they were not uniquely evil people. The truth is that without vigilance, any country can go down the road of racism and fascism. And today, in the Western world where we live, far too many people are making the same fatal mistake as the East Prussians made some 90 years ago. Compare the Western world today with where East Prussia was before the Nazis. People aren't getting paid enough, everything costs too much, people are struggling to afford basic needs and housing. And the situation for East Prussians back then sounds like our lives today. Nazis use these situations to gain power by turning people's struggles into hate against those they claim are inferior. And these Nazis will try to lie to us, divide us, and turn us against one another, but the reality is they don't care about any of us. Who wasn't running away in the end from East Prussia like a weak coward? It was Erich Koch, the East Prussian Nazi leader, and just like the rest of the Nazis, he was too afraid to face the music for his crimes. The Nazis told the East Prussians that they would easily crush the Soviets because they said they were the German master race and the Soviet Red Army was formed from over 100 different ethnic groups. But where's all these so-called master race East Prussians at today? They're gone. They're not here anymore. East Prussia doesn't exist anymore. Racism comes from weakness, and strength comes from working class unity. The Nazis in Königsberg rejected civilian evacuations numerous times, and instead of protecting their own people, they spent their time murdering innocent people right up until the very end. And then the leaders ran away and left a bunch of child soldiers and their grandpas behind to fight in their place. If we don't take action in our communities today across the Western world to stop Nazism while we still can, we will meet the same fate as Königsberg and the rest of East Prussia. Total destruction. I don't know what better lesson we can take from this history. Crush Nazism every time it tries to raise its ugly head, or we will be crushed ourselves. I'm here at one of the actual Soviet tanks that rolled into this city 80 years ago and started a new chapter for this land. And I'd like to lay this flower here, as many others have, out of tremendous respect for the enormous sacrifice sustained by the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. And I'd like to dedicate this video and all of the work that went into it to the millions of brave men and women who fought against Nazism. Never forget their sacrifice. Spasibo большое.
Армия, черный барон, снова готовит нам царский трон. Но от тайги до британских морей Красная армия всех сильней, такой же красная. Сжимает властно, слышит мозолистой рукой. Если должны мы неудержимо идти в последний смертный бой. За дело правое и пути лавою зальемся мы в единый стан. Несокрушимый, непобедимый союз рабочих и крестьян. Уверенным голосом миру твердим, граждан России всегда защитим. Но от тайги до британских морей Красная армия всех сильней, такой же красная. Сжимает властно, защит мозолистой рукой. И все должны мы неудержимо идти в последний смертный бой.